A young black man had recently been promoted to CEO of a successful company, a dream he had worked years to achieve. Today, he dressed casually for a change, wanting to keep things relaxed before a big meeting downtown. On his way, he decided to stop at a small cafe to grab coffee. He was feeling proud and excited about the meeting ahead, hoping to make a great impression on his team and set a strong example. As he waited outside the cafe for his coffee, he noticed a police officer approaching him with a cold, suspicious look. The officer, a white man who seemed confident and assertive, didn't hesitate to stop him. Without introducing himself or giving any reason, the officer demanded to see the young man's ID, implying that he was out of place. The young man's heart sank, recognizing the situation all too well. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way, but today it felt especially hurtful. The young man handed over his ID without making a fuss, thinking it would avoid further conflict. He didn't want to ruin his mood before such an important day. But as the officer looked over his ID, there was an air of condescension in his tone. The officer didn't seem interested in understanding who he was or why he was there. Instead, he made some offhand, disrespectful remarks that felt both uncalled for and offensive. The young man stayed calm, even though a mix of frustration and sadness was building inside him. He had grown accustomed to these moments, but that didn't make them any less hurtful or exhausting. The officer began to lecture him about not loitering and told him to move along. The young man attempted to explain that he was only waiting for his driver to take him to his office for an important meeting, but the officer didn't seem to care. He cut him off, saying that he shouldn't expect special treatment, as if the young man had asked for any. People nearby started to take notice of the exchange, sensing that something wasn't right. Some onlookers paused, glancing between the officer and the young man, wondering why this interaction was happening at all. Despite everything, the young man kept his cool. He chose not to raise his voice or argue, knowing that escalating things could lead to unnecessary trouble. Instead, he remained composed, hoping that his patience would speak louder than words. It wasn't easy, but he felt it was the right thing to do. He didn't want to let one person's judgment spoil the day he had worked so hard to reach. He kept reminding himself that he was more than anyone's assumptions. At that moment, a car pulled up, and a well-dressed driver stepped out, greeting the young man respectfully. The driver opened the car door, and with a simple nod, the young man prepared to leave. Seeing this, the officer seemed taken aback, his attitude visibly shifting. The onlookers exchanged knowing looks, realizing there was more to the young man than the officer had assumed. The young man glanced at the officer one last time, giving him a calm but powerful look, one that held disappointment rather than anger. He then stepped into the car without another word, leaving the officer standing there, a bit stunned by how the situation had flipped. After the encounter, the young man sat quietly in the car, trying to shake off the experience and refocused on his upcoming meeting. He reminded himself that he had worked too hard to let a stranger's assumptions ruin his day. Despite how calm he had looked, a mix of emotions churned within him. He felt disappointed and hurt, but tried to keep his mind on the positive. Soon, he would be in his office, surrounded by people who respected him, and this incident would be just a passing memory. As the car moved through the city streets, he looked out the window, watching people go about their day. For a moment, he let himself reflect on what had just happened. Being treated with suspicion just because of his appearance was not new to him, yet it always left a lasting mark. He had faced situations like this before, and each time, he reminded himself to stay calm and collected. The thought of letting someone's prejudice ruin his focus had never appealed to him. But today, it felt different. Maybe it was because of how hard he had worked to get where he was, or maybe it was because he was finally in a position where he could actually influence change. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't let this incident get under his skin. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, sensing his mood. He kindly asked if everything was okay. The young man offered a small smile and nodded, appreciating the support. It was one of those small, human moments that helped lift his spirits, reminding him that not everyone saw him the way the officer did. Soon, the car approached the tall building where his office was located. As he stepped out, he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and reminded himself that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. Inside the building, he was greeted warmly by his team. The sight of his coworkers and the welcoming environment helped ease the lingering frustration. He focused on his work, and within minutes, he was back to his confident self, ready to tackle the day's challenges. He had an important meeting to lead, and he knew his role carried weight. He would be discussing projects that would bring growth to the company and benefit many people. As he prepared his notes, though, he couldn't completely push the earlier incident out of his mind. He knew that experiences like his weren't rare, and they left people feeling drained and demoralized. It reminded him of the importance of his position, not just as a leader, but as someone who could change perspectives and promote fairness. He had always wanted to create an environment where everyone felt respected and valued, and today only strengthened that resolve. He took a final glance at his reflection in the office window, gathering his thoughts. He knew he had a responsibility not just to himself, but to others who faced similar struggles. His journey had been full of obstacles, but each one had only strengthened his resolve to make a difference. And now, standing in this powerful position, he felt more committed than ever to use his influence in a way that might change things, even if only in small ways. With that thought, he turned his focus entirely to the meeting ahead, determined to lead with purpose and show others the strength that comes from patience and integrity. The young man's day continued as he led his team through a productive and inspiring meeting. He focused on each person's input, encouraging them to share ideas and suggestions. His style of leadership was grounded in respect and openness, qualities he valued deeply. As he listened to his team speak, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing he was creating an environment where people felt valued and heard. After the meeting, he returned to his office and checked his schedule, seeing he had a short break before his next appointment. It was a rare moment of quiet, giving him time to reflect on the events of the morning. No matter how hard he tried to shake off his run-in with the police officer, it lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over his otherwise positive day. He thought about how he tried to explain himself and how quickly the officer had dismissed him. No matter what he had said or done, it seemed the officer had already made up his mind. That feeling of being judged for something beyond his control was difficult to let go. He leaned back in his chair, looking around his office at the achievements he'd worked so hard for. Framed certificates, awards, and photos with his team reminded him of how far he had come. But they also reminded him of the challenges he'd faced along the way. Moments like these had often tested him, and he had learned that the best response was to keep moving forward. Still, he couldn't help but wonder why things hadn't changed. How many more people like him were out there, facing the same judgment without a voice or platform to speak up? Lost in thought, he was surprised when his assistant knocked on the door to remind him of his next meeting. Today, he had a scheduled discussion with a local law enforcement representative about a community program they were working on together. It was part of an initiative he'd been passionate about, bringing business leaders and law enforcement together to create understanding and reduce tension. He believed that communication was key to breaking down stereotypes and building trust, and this program was one small way he hoped to make a difference. As he walked to the meeting room, he mentally prepared himself, knowing that this conversation held special significance after what he experienced that morning. When he entered the room, he was surprised to see a familiar face. It was the same police officer from the cafe. The officer looked just as surprised, his eyes widening as he recognized the young man he had dismissed only hours earlier. For a moment, there was a heavy silence between them, both caught off guard by the unexpected encounter. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence from earlier replaced by an awkward tension. He seemed uncertain, as if struggling to find the right words. The young man stayed calm, simply extending his hand in a friendly, professional gesture. He knew this was an opportunity, a chance to approach the situation with respect and set an example. He greeted the officer warmly, as if their earlier meeting had never happened, hoping to create a fresh start. The officer, visibly embarrassed, shook his hand, mumbling a quiet greeting in return. It was clear that he was uncomfortable, unsure how to act now that he knew the young man's role and influence. As they sat down to discuss the program, the officer seemed distracted, his mind likely replaying the events of the morning. The young man, on the other hand, kept his focus on the task at hand, determined to make the most of this meeting. Throughout the discussion, he spoke about the importance of mutual respect and understanding, emphasizing that everyone, regardless of background, had something valuable to contribute. He could see that his words were sinking in, that the officer was not only listening, but also reflecting on his own behavior. For the young man, it was a small but meaningful victory, a chance to open someone's eyes, to show how easily assumptions could be wrong and how important it was to look beyond appearances. The conversation between the young man and the officer continued, and slowly, the tension began to lift. As they discussed the community program, the young man could see that the officer was listening closely, more carefully than he had at the cafe that morning. There was an intensity in the officer's eyes, as though he was processing not only the details of the program, but also of his own actions from earlier. The young man chose to ignore the awkwardness that lingered and focused on the work they were doing together. His hope was that, by the end of this meeting, they might not just be partners in a project, but understand each other a little better. The young man talked about his vision for the program, emphasizing how essential it was for people from different backgrounds to come together and listen to one another. He explained how, through open dialogues, they could break down barriers and build a stronger, more unified community. As he spoke, the officer seemed to relax a little, nodding along, his earlier defensiveness melting away. Perhaps he hadn't expected the young man to be so calm, respectful, and focused on solutions rather than holding grudges. But for the young man, this approach was second nature. He believed that progress was only possible if people worked together and tried to understand each other. At one point, the officer asked a question about the program, trying to grasp the goals and benefits. The young man explained patiently, his tone confident but kind. He wanted the officer to see that this wasn't just another task on his schedule, but a mission he was passionate about. He shared stories of how, in the past, he'd seen people come together in ways that transformed neighborhoods and changed lives. His voice softened as he spoke, his words coming straight from the heart. The officer listened, seeming genuinely touched, maybe even a bit inspired. The officer cleared his throat, hesitating before he spoke again. He glanced down, as if gathering his thoughts, and finally, he looked back up and said something unexpected. He admitted that he might have judged the young man too quickly that morning. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, and there was a hint of regret in his expression. He seemed to be realizing that his actions hadn't just been unprofessional, but hurtful and unnecessary. The young man listened, appreciating the officer's honesty, and responded with a reassuring nod. He could see the discomfort on the officer's face, the weight of realizing that his assumptions had been wrong. Instead of focusing on the apology, the young man guided the conversation back to the program, keeping things professional, but with a sense of warmth. He wanted the officer to feel that it was okay to learn from mistakes, that growth was possible as long as people were willing to change. His attitude showed that he wasn't holding on to resentment. He was here to create something positive. This genuine acceptance seemed to put the officer at ease, showing him that, despite their earlier interaction, the young man was open to working together with respect and understanding. As they wrapped up the meeting, the young man could feel a shift in the atmosphere. There was a new sense of mutual respect between them. The officer, who had been so certain of his own judgments earlier, was now seeing the young man in a completely new light. The young man had shown that strength wasn't about anger or confrontation, but about handling situations with grace and patience. Walking out of the meeting room, the officer's expression had softened, and there was a slight smile on his face, almost as if a weight had been lifted. He thanked the young man for his time, and his tone was genuine, even grateful. The young man nodded in return, knowing that this was only the beginning. This project had the potential to make a real difference, and perhaps, through this work, they could reach even more people who might need a similar reminder. After their meeting, the officer couldn't shake the feeling of regret. As he walked back to his patrol car, his mind replayed the scene from that morning at the cafe. He remembered the young man standing there calmly, offering his ID without protest and trying to explain himself with respect, even while being dismissed. Now that he knew who the young man was and saw how professional and inspiring he could be, the officer felt embarrassed about how he had handled the situation. For years, he had seen himself as someone who served the community, yet today, he realized he had let his own assumptions and biases cloud his actions. The officer sat in his car, staring at the steering wheel, thinking about the words the young man had shared during the meeting. The young man's message about respect and understanding kept echoing in his mind. The officer had always believed he treated people fairly, but the events of the day had shown him he still had a lot to learn. He felt humbled and a little shaken, realizing that his actions could have easily hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. Later that afternoon, the officer arrived at the large corporate office building for the second meeting related to the community program. As he walked through the grand lobby and saw employees greeting the young man with respect, he felt a pang of guilt all over again. Here was someone who had not only worked his way up to a powerful position, but was also trying to create positive change for everyone. And instead of supporting that, the officer had unfairly judged him. The officer took a deep breath and entered the meeting room, where he was once again face to face with the young man. This time, though, the dynamic felt completely different. The officer had let go of his previous assumptions and now saw the young man as a leader and partner. He respected the young man's calm strength, his ability to stay collected, and the professionalism he had shown despite the morning's events. As the meeting went on, the officer noticed how the young man led discussions with ease, involving everyone and valuing each opinion. The young man's leadership style was inspiring, and the officer couldn't help but admire how he made everyone feel heard and respected. This was someone who clearly valued people for who they were, not for how they looked or where they came from. And in that moment, the officer felt a strong desire to learn from him, to become better himself, and to do his job with the same level of respect and understanding. At the end of the meeting, as people started to leave, the officer lingered for a moment. Gathering his courage, he approached the young man and offered a sincere apology. He spoke from the heart, admitting that he had misjudged him earlier and that he was truly sorry for how he had acted. The officer explained that he was trying to do better, that this experience had opened his eyes to his own biases. The young man listened quietly, his face thoughtful and kind. He accepted the officer's apology with genuine warmth, telling him that what mattered was the willingness to grow. He assured the officer that everyone made mistakes, and the important thing was learning from them. His words were simple, but they carried a lot of weight, and the officer felt both relieved and inspired. As they shook hands, the young man mentioned how he looked forward to working together on the community project, knowing that they both had something valuable to bring to the table. The officer left the building with a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been an unexpected learning experience, and he was grateful for it. He realized that he had the power to make a difference, starting with his own actions and attitudes. As he walked back to his patrol car, he felt a strong sense of commitment to change and the hope that, with effort, he could become the kind of officer who truly served and respected every person in his community. The next day, the young man returned to his office with a renewed focus on the community program. He knew that bringing people together wasn't easy, especially when misunderstandings and assumptions were so common. But the meeting with the officer had reminded him of the importance of his mission. He saw firsthand how one conversation could start a change, and he was determined to keep pushing for a community where people treated each other with fairness and respect. As he settled in for the day, he received a message from his assistant about an upcoming event in the community. The event was aimed at bringing local businesses, community members, and law enforcement together. This was part of the program's mission, but it was also a way to bring people together in a setting where they could talk openly, share stories, and hopefully bridge some gaps. The young man saw it as a perfect chance to continue the work he was passionate about, and he wanted to make the event as impactful as possible. He quickly started making plans, calling on his team to brainstorm ideas for the event. He wanted everyone to feel comfortable and welcome, so they thought of activities that would encourage people to interact naturally. There would be discussions, but also some casual gatherings where people could chat over food and music. The young man believed that sometimes the most meaningful connections happened in these simple, relaxed settings. Meanwhile, the officer was also preparing for the event. He was nervous but hopeful, thinking about how he could make a difference. He knew this was an opportunity to connect with the community in a positive way, and he didn't want to let it slip by. The encounter with the young man had inspired him deeply, and he felt ready to show people that he was open to learning and understanding. He thought about the lessons he had learned, about respect, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. This time, he wanted to be someone people could trust and relate to, not just an authority figure. On the day of the event, the young man arrived early, helping his team set up tables, arrange decorations, and organize the flow of the gathering. As people started arriving, he greeted each guest warmly, making sure everyone felt at ease. He noticed how different groups from the community slowly started mingling, introducing themselves and sharing small conversations. He felt a sense of pride watching his vision come to life, even if just for a day. The officer arrived shortly after, his demeanor calm but purposeful. He noticed the young man and walked over to greet him, a friendly smile on his face. The young man returned the smile, genuinely happy to see the officer there. The two exchanged a few words, and it was clear that both of them understood the significance of this moment. They had started as strangers with very different perspectives, yet here they were, working side by side to bring people together. As the event unfolded, the young man and the officer joined different groups, talking to people and encouraging open conversations. The officer shared a few stories about his experiences in the community, speaking honestly about the challenges he faced, but also his desire to improve. People listened, some nodding and understanding, others asking questions. The officer was surprised at how willing people were to engage, and he felt grateful for the opportunity to show his genuine side. The young man, too, shared his story of working his way up in business, touching on the obstacles he faced and the reasons behind his commitment to building bridges. He explained how important it was for him to create spaces where everyone could feel safe and respected. As he spoke, he could see people connecting with his words, understanding that his work was not just about business, but about making a real difference in people's lives. The event continued with laughter, storytelling, and new connections being made. Both the young man and the officer felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that they had planted seeds of change. As the sun began to set, they looked around at the diverse group of people chatting, laughing, and connecting in ways that hadn't seemed possible just days before. In that moment, they realized that sometimes a single event could spark a change that would last far longer than the day itself. As the evening settled in, the atmosphere at the event grew even more vibrant. People who had once seemed hesitant were now talking openly with each other. It was a refreshing change, and the young man couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in how smoothly everything was unfolding. He watched as local residents, business owners, and officers mingled, sharing laughs and stories that seemed to bridge the usual gaps. It was exactly what he had hoped for, an event that would spark real conversations and maybe even lasting friendships. At one point, the young man noticed a small group forming around the officer, who seemed to be speaking earnestly about his experiences as a cop. He was explaining how his job could be challenging, and that, like anyone else, he had moments where he struggled. But he also shared his hopes, particularly for building a more positive relationship with the community he served. His honesty surprised a few people who had probably never heard an officer speak so openly. They listened closely, nodding along, and some even shared their own stories about interactions with the police, some good, some difficult. The officer, rather than getting defensive, listened attentively, acknowledging that there was always room to improve. Seeing this, the young man walked over to join the group, standing beside the officer as a silent show of support. As they listened together, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that this was what his efforts had led to, a moment where differences were put aside and understanding began to take root. The officer glanced at him, and there was a look of mutual respect in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement that they were both working toward the same goal. After a while, the young man invited everyone to sit together in a larger circle to wrap up the day with a group discussion. He suggested that anyone who wanted to share their thoughts about the event could do so, whether it was about their experience today or their hopes for the future. He wanted to give people the space to speak freely, believing that everyone's perspective could add value. One by one, people began to share. Some spoke about how they'd entered the event with uncertainty, not sure if it would make a difference, but were now leaving with a renewed sense of hope. A few community members expressed how they appreciated the chance to see officers in a new light, to hear them speak about their jobs and lives as regular people, not just as uniforms. Others talked about the need for more events like this, where people could talk openly, without judgment, and find common ground. When it was the officer's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, looking around at the faces in the circle. He shared that this event had been as meaningful for him as it was for anyone else. He admitted that he had learned a lot, not only about the community, but about himself as well. He thanked everyone for their honesty and kindness, saying that their words had given him a fresh perspective and strengthened his commitment to serve fairly and without bias. His words were heartfelt, and the sincerity in his voice was clear. Finally, the young man spoke. He expressed his gratitude to everyone who had shown up and participated with open minds and open hearts. He shared that, for him, this was just the beginning of what he hoped would be an ongoing journey of understanding and growth for the community. His voice was steady and sincere as he reminded everyone that the power to create change lay in their hands, by choosing to respect and learn from each other. As the group began to disperse, many people lingered, continuing their conversations in small groups. The young man felt a sense of accomplishment and relief, knowing that the event had gone even better than he had hoped. The officer stayed back as well, quietly thanking him for the opportunity to be part of something meaningful. They shared a firm handshake, both understanding the significance of the day and what it represented. Walking back to his car, the officer felt a new resolve. He knew he had made mistakes in the past, but today had shown him that change was possible, starting with himself. The young man, too, felt inspired, knowing that he had helped create something meaningful, something that could ripple out into the community in ways he might not even see. As he watched people leaving with smiles and laughter, he felt confident that this was only the start of something much larger. The days following the community event were filled with a new energy. The young man continued to work on the project, but now there was a noticeable shift in the way people engaged with it. More businesses were reaching out, asking how they could get involved in future programs. The officer, too, was taking his role more seriously. He began organizing small meetings with local leaders, officers, and community members to discuss how they could build stronger connections and create more opportunities for understanding. The young man noticed that the officer had become more visible in the community, attending meetings and events with a genuine desire to listen and learn. One afternoon, the young man ran into the officer at a local coffee shop. It was an unplanned but welcome encounter. The officer waved as he saw him enter, and they exchanged greetings. They decided to sit together for a coffee, talking casually about their days. For the first time, the young man could see the officer more as a person than a symbol of authority. He had become more approachable, open, and willing to have conversations that truly mattered. They spoke about the work ahead. The young man shared some new ideas he had for future community events. He was focused on expanding the reach of the program, hoping to involve even more people from all walks of life. He believed the more diverse the group, the more impactful the change would be. The officer listened carefully, nodding, offering his thoughts when asked. He had started to understand the importance of creating these spaces where people could be honest, share their experiences, and work together towards solutions. The officer mentioned how he had been reflecting on the event and his own behavior. He admitted that, before meeting the young man, he had been unsure about how to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. But after spending time with him and seeing the way the young man connected with people, he felt inspired to do better. He realized that his approach needed to be more about listening than simply enforcing the law. This realization had changed how he interacted with people. He began approaching situations with more empathy and patience, always reminding himself that every person he interacted with had a story to tell. The young man smiled, grateful to hear how much the officer had grown in such a short period. It made him realize how much potential there was for positive change when people were willing to listen and open themselves up to new perspectives. He also appreciated that the officer wasn't just making empty promises. He could see the officer's actions aligning with his words, which gave him confidence in the officer's dedication to change. They spent the next hour talking about how to take their efforts to the next level. The officer suggested a few ideas, like starting mentorship programs where officers could partner with young people in the community to provide guidance and support. The young man liked the idea and added that there should be a focus on building trust between the two groups, allowing for real conversations to take place. They both agreed that it would take time, but with patience and consistent effort, they could create a lasting impact. As they parted ways, the young man felt a sense of hope. The officer had come a long way, and together, they had built something meaningful. It was clear to him that this wasn't just about a single event or a one-time program. It was about a long-term effort to change the culture of the community. The young man understood that progress wouldn't always be easy, but seeing the officer's commitment and knowing the support they had from others made him believe that it was possible. That evening, he received a call from the officer, who wanted to discuss one more idea. He suggested creating a public platform where people could share their stories, whether it was an experience with the police or a personal story of overcoming obstacles. The young man agreed, and they began to plan it together. They saw it as an opportunity to create more open dialogue and transparency, where everyone could be heard. As the days passed, the young man realized how much the officer's shift in mindset had impacted him too. He had always believed in the power of understanding, but now he saw how powerful it could be when someone like the officer was willing to take responsibility for his actions and grow. They were building something bigger than just a community program. They were building a bridge that connected people who might have never understood each other before. With every step forward, the young man felt more certain that the work they were doing could change lives, just as it had already begun to change his. As the weeks went by, the young man and the officer continued to work together on their shared goals. The community program they had started was growing, slowly but surely, and the feedback from the community was overwhelmingly positive. People who had once felt disconnected from law enforcement now saw a more human side to it. Officers were showing up at events not just to enforce rules, but to genuinely engage with people. The young man noticed that more and more residents were coming forward with ideas and suggestions for improving their neighborhoods. There was a growing sense of unity, something that had been missing before. One afternoon, the young man sat down to review the progress they had made. He reflected on everything that had happened since that first, tense meeting with the officer. At that moment, it felt like a lifetime ago. They had come so far, and there was still so much more to do. He remembered the day he learned about the officer's past actions, how it felt to be disrespected and unfairly judged. Yet, instead of holding on to resentment, he had chosen to be open to change. It had not been easy, but it had led them both to a place of growth, understanding, and mutual respect. The officer, too, had been reflecting on the impact of the changes he had made. He had come to see how crucial it was to build trust with the community. As much as he loved his job, he now understood that being a good officer wasn't just about enforcing laws or wearing a badge. It was about building relationships, listening without judgment, and being present in a way that allowed others to see him as someone who truly cared. He had also learned that people needed to feel heard, whether they were facing struggles or sharing successes, and it was his job to make them feel safe enough to do that. Both the young man and the officer knew they were at the beginning of something much bigger. They still faced challenges, of course. There were still misunderstandings, and not everyone was on board with their mission. But they didn't let that stop them. Instead, they used those challenges as opportunities to keep pushing forward, to keep finding ways to bring people together. They knew that change didn't happen overnight, but they were determined to be part of the solution, no matter how long it took. Soon, they had organized another event, this time, a larger gathering that included not just local businesses and officers, but also schools, youth groups, and families. The goal was to keep the conversation going, to keep building on the foundation they had created. This event was bigger than the last one, but it was also more meaningful. It wasn't just about getting people in a room together. It was about continuing the work they had started and deepening the connections between everyone involved. There were workshops, discussions, and even performances from local artists. It was a celebration of what they had achieved so far, but also a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. The officer stood in the back of the room, watching people laugh, talk, and connect. He saw faces he hadn't seen before, people who hadn't come to the first event, but were now eager to be part of the conversation. He smiled to himself, feeling a sense of pride in what they had created. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was progress, and that was enough for now. The young man walked up to him, his face beaming with happiness. "We did it," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "Look at this. Look at how far we've come." The officer nodded, his smile just as wide. "We're not done yet," he replied. "But this is a good start." The two of them stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of excitement, hope, and possibility. The young man realized that this was the kind of change he had always dreamed of. It wasn't about fighting against people. It was about working with them, about finding common ground and building something better together. As the night went on and the event wrapped up, the young man and the officer shared a quiet conversation. They knew that the real work was still ahead, but they had made a lasting impact. They had proved that respect, understanding, and willingness to grow could change everything. What had started as a tense and difficult encounter had led them both to a place of trust, respect, and partnership. Together, they had shown that one person's willingness to open up could inspire a ripple effect that could change an entire community. The young man walked home that evening with a sense of peace. He had started this journey unsure of what would come of it, but now, as he looked back on everything they had accomplished, he knew that he had made a difference. He had taken a chance on change, and in doing so, he had helped create a better world for everyone. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt confident that they were on the right path, together.